watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
It was quite a year for the Jewish world, 2010, that included superhuman efforts in service to others through issues of controversy and attacks on Israel and continuing attempts to delegitimize the Jewish state and the Jewish people, to a complicated relationship with the American administration and an apparently disappointing peace process. What were the major events of 2010 that will impact the Jewish future? For some insight, we're joined by Neal Sher, a former director of AIPAC, the past head of the U.S. Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations, which tracked Nazi war criminals in the United States, and Neal is currently a lawyer in private practice in New York. Binyamin Buddy Korn, a past director of the media watchdog Camera, and a past editor of the Jewish Exponent in Philadelphia, and the founder of the website Jews for Sarah, which informs American Jews of the policy positions taken by Sarah Palin. And Buddy Korn also hosts Jewish Independent Talk Radio in Greater Philadelphia and available on the internet. Ron Skolnik, Executive Director of MERETZ USA, a leading progressive Zionist organization with links to Israel's Meretz Party. And Dr. Stephen Bayme, Director of the Contemporary Jewish Life Department of the American Jewish Committee and of the Koppelman Institute on American Jewish-Israeli Relations, all discussing the year 2010 on this edition of Roundtable. So lucky me, I have the chance to sit with four of my favorite people to talk about 2010 and the Jewish year. And I've explained that basically what I'm interested in is hearing from Neal and Buddy and Ron and Stephen. First, what do they think were the major events of 2010 from a Jewish perspective that will impact the Jewish future? And second, sometimes there are events which are just at the time formative. They shape the personality and character of a given year, even if they don't have long-range effects. And I'm looking to them to see what they feel were the Jewish moments of 2010, which either have long-range effects or which just colored the tone, temperament, and character of 2010. I want to begin first, though, Neal, by asking you to talk about what you would consider to be the single most important event of 2010, or even the not only a specific event, but a trend of 2010, which you do think will have long-range effect in Jewish life.
Yeah, I think that right now Israel is engaged in a war. It's under attack by those who wish to demonize and delegitimize it. Mm-hmm. It's been going on for a while. It has gathered steam in the past year. Late in 2009, we had the Goldstone debacle. And I think that this effort to delegitimize, which all Israeli leaders understand to be a threat to its national security, affects Israel, it affects the diaspora, and the one event in 2010, which perhaps symbolizes the efforts to delegitimize, was the flotilla. Because the aim of the flotilla was not to bring humanitarian aid to people in Gaza. It was, in essence, to demonize and in so doing delegitimize or attempt to delegitimize Israel. We see this delegitimization as a phenomenon that's going to carry on, and I've got to say that those orchestrating it know what they're doing. They're organized, they're well funded, and they pose a real threat. We see it on university campuses with groups like the Students for Justice in Palestine. We see it in other countries like the UK, like in even in Scandinavia and Belgium, where they want to boycott and divest and have sanctions. It's terrible. And we see it also, and this has a real impact in the region, from the Palestinian Authority. They have been nonstop, and I'm talking about the PA, not Hamas, not Jihad, of trying to attack Israel with libels. There's a huge number of Palestinian Authority-sponsored TV and media which accuse the Israelis of spreading AIDS, of getting Palestinian kids hooked on drugs. These institutions also praise jihadists, and Mahmoud Abbas, when he speaks to his people, does it relentlessly. It's all part of the delegitimization. And finally, I don't want to hog the time, but what has had an effect on delegitimization was, at least early on, some of the policies of our own administration here. When within the first week of his administration, Obama says the biggest obstacle are these settlements, including in East Jerusalem, and made that the center point of his policy, saying, as they did, as they continue to say, that unless you solve the Palestinian problem with Israel, which is to say, push Israel, we'll never be able to deal with Iran. The Arab nations will never, ever come to our support. Well, we now know, because of the WikiLeaks, that that was all malarkey, that Obama and Clinton were getting regular reports from their people on the ground where the Arab states, first of all, were not interested in the Palestinians, and secondly, they were really scared and are scared of Iran. Nevertheless, they kept perpetuating this notion that Israel was a stumbling block, and that had a serious impact in my mind on Israel's standing.
Okay, there are many people who would say that one of the main themes of the Jewish year 2010 is the ramping up of this attempt to delegitimize Israel. Incidentally, do you remember the Time magazine cover page, which may be symbolic of how it expressed itself on the American scene, where there was a piece by Carl Vick, and the title was "Why Israel Doesn't Care About Peace." The article itself, by the way, was not so bad, but the cover itself was, for many people, a symbol of the delegitimization of Israel. I want to hold off on the discussion of where the Palestinians come in, because that leads us to a discussion of where the peace process is, and there may be some disagreement about that. I want to know if there's consensus, though, Stephen, that you also feel that the delegitimization of Israel, that attempt is a theme of 2010.
Well, without question, it's a theme, and much of what Neal says is quite correct. I would distinguish probably, though, between domestic America and American society and what's going on internationally. In Europe, the delegitimization of Israel is quite powerful. It has had numerous expressions, and intellectual opinion in many ways has tilted in that direction. It should be of enormous concern to us because any time before the year 2000, I can't think of people who are saying Israel does not exist as a legitimate state. Now that we're hearing that, that should be of enormous concern to us. In terms of America, notwithstanding the headlines that different groups grab in one moment or another, in terms of American higher education, there certainly is no leader in higher education that believes in boycott or divestment from Israel. The cause of Israel, I think, is very popular within the American public. The polls continue to indicate that Americans favor Israel by 4-to-1 margins. Probably the weakest link in the famous infamous book by Walton Mearsheimer, The Israel Lobby, is that the authors totally ignored the fact that 97% of the pro-Israel support in this country comes from Gentile sources. That suggests that Israel is hardly illegitimate by American canons. So in that respect, I fully agree it's a significant theme. It does need to be engaged. I'd be more concerned about engaging it in Europe. In America, I think we've kept our guard up quite successfully.
Ron, what's your sense about the same question? Again, I'm not interested now talking about Palestinians and Israelis. I'm talking about whether you see as a theme Jewishly in 2010, whether an increasing attempt to delegitimize Israel was important or not.
Well, I think it's certainly a theme. I think that the efforts to delegitimize Israel are growing, but I also think that the raw material to do that has been increasing and increasingly supplied by the Israeli government, unfortunately. I think I have a disagreement, and as a progressive Zionist, I'm concerned for Israel's future, but I have a disagreement that there's a grand scheme of thousands and thousands of college students and academics around the country. I think what we have are people who do want to delegitimize Israel, and I think a vast majority of people who want to help make things better. They may not go into the intricacies of what the occupation is about, or about Khartoum in 1967, or the Hamas charter. They know there's an occupation. They see Israel as the occupier. They want to make things better. And I think, to a certain extent, I think that the American Jewish community needs to pull back a little bit and not just worry about BDS and delegitimization, but to see that there are actually good people who are not anti-Israel who are involved in these things, but they just feel frustrated that they don't know how to make things better.
Okay, then let's move to that issue. I know that all of you were very aware of the Peter Beinart article. And Peter Beinart basically says in 2010 that there's been a major shift on the American Jewish scene, especially among young people, and that there's been a shift away from classical Jewish liberalism, and that young people and liberals in general in the Jewish community are becoming less enamored with, less supportive of the state of Israel. To what extent did Beinart's article, number one, reflect the truth, in your perspective, Ron? And what does it mean for the Jewish future?
I think it was a significant piece of writing in that it drew a sharp line, and it had been done before by others, but never so significantly, about Jews who feel that they're so committed to Israel that they sort of get their marching orders from the government and do what the government of Israel asks them to do, and others who say, I'm first and foremost a lover of Israel who questions everything, and including in that, I question the policy of Israel, and that's my right not only as a thinking citizen of the world, but as somebody who cares about Israel, to think and to state my opinion publicly. And I think that's what the line that he drew.
Do you feel there has been in some way a defection among Jewish liberals in terms of a liberalism when it applies to Israel?
Well, I can tell you this. Zionism is becoming an increasingly difficult word to support amongst the young generation of liberals.
Because?
Because Zionism has been, unfortunately, has been made to seem that strand, that ideology promoted by people who want a greater Israel, who want to settle in the West Bank, who would sooner drive out Palestinians from the West Bank than leave the West Bank and have a majority Jewish state with full rights for all. So a lot of people are feeding off that. They're not listening to the MERETZ USA brand of Zionism.
Which is?
Which is that Israel can be both a majority Jewish state with a Jewish character, but also provide equal rights to its citizens and can live side by side in peace with a Palestinian state.
And isn't that a mainstream Israeli and Jewish perspective?
You asked me whether it's happening amongst young people.
Yes.
Young people are not buying it.
Why not?
Why not? You have to look to the leadership of the Israeli government, unfortunately, and you have to look to what I would call the enabling posture of what I would call the American Jewish mainstream.
So it's Israel's fault and it's American Jewry's fault?
I think that Israel is not helping.
Okay,
I never like to reduce it to...
Stephen Bayme?
Look, I agree fully that there is a need to reclaim a liberal Zionism, and if you want to critique American Jewry for failing to do so, I think that's an area we really have to engage. But Beinart committed three major flaws. Number one, in terms of young people, frankly, and he himself has said this publicly since then, much more attention needs to be given to assimilation than to a defection from liberalism. If young people don't care about Israel, it's because they don't care about matters Jewish. And in that respect, the toll of assimilation is very great. And to harness that to the issue of, well, they don't like Israel because they don't like Israeli policies, most of them don't know enough about Israeli policies or Israeli political figures to really have that kind of a strong opinion. Secondly, I think what was missing in the article was a sense of context of what Israel is up against. We alluded to this earlier in terms of the delegitimization of Israel. You deflected a little discussions about the Palestinian problem. When the Palestinians delegitimate Israel, and when you have Ahmadinejad threatening to exterminate Israel, you can't exactly pretend that doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. And you wouldn't know that from Beinart's article. There was a lack of context of the world in which Israel is living and what Israel faces in the Middle East. And thirdly, there was a certain historical myopia in the article, namely that when he critiques the American Jewish establishment, the AJC and other Jewish organizations for our support for Israeli governmental policies, he's forgetting the lessons of the 1930s. Breckinridge Long, Roosevelt's refugee officer, sent a letter back to his boss saying, we've got 50 different Jewish groups coming down here to Washington, each one with their own agenda. Better do nothing, because if you try to satisfy one of them, you're going to alienate 49 others. Well, that's why there is such strong support behind the government of Israel, the legally elected democratic government of Israel, in terms of Washington, as opposed to internally inside the Jewish community, where we have many different opinions about all sorts of issues. So in that respect, I think the article was flawed. On the other hand, I would say, number one, yes, there is a need to reclaim Zionism as a liberal cause as well as a conservative cause. And secondly, a lot more attention needs to be given to one of his sub-themes in the article, namely an ascending demographic, a demographic ascendancy of Orthodoxy within the pro-Israel community. That has implications that, frankly, are not very healthy, not that there's anything
What are
wrong.
the implications?
If the cause of Israel becomes identified with a narrow sector of the Jewish community, by definition, it's an attenuated cause, attenuated political cause. We have to demonstrate to the American public that Israel commands support within the broad reaches of the Jewish community. And in that respect, a growing demographic ascendancy of pro-Israel support within Orthodoxy, it may be good news for Orthodoxy. I tend to doubt it, but it certainly is not good for the Jewish community or for the cause of Israel.
Interesting. Buddy?
Well, naturally, we disagree about that, Stephen. But I would say I have two big problems since you're referencing Peter Beinart's article. And by the way, he dropped another bombshell last week in attacking Bibi Netanyahu and saying, you got what you want. The diplomatic process has collapsed. It was a disgusting piece. It was a sarcastic and revolting way to address the Prime Minister of Israel or anyone that we should be respecting for their leadership and their service. But having said that, I think that there is a problem that Steve alluded to and that Beinart discussed in the article vis-a-vis how the American Jewish community is relating to the growing Orthodox element within us, of which I am a part. The mainstream of Jewish communal leadership, as we think of ourselves, the disconnect between that and the Orthodox world, not entirely the full, certainly, of the mainstream Jewish leadership. The Orthodox world has many agendas of its own that are not friendly. But, you know, to sit and fret that support for Israel would be confined to this one segment of the community, it seems to me, is a failure of imagination of our community about how to integrate the different sectors.
I don't accept the fact, under any circumstances, that people that support or even attempt to have sanctions, divestment, and boycotts can in any way, under any circumstance, consider themselves really to be pro-Israel. And a lot of the new left that Beinart is talking about, their agenda is the pro-left agenda, and they happen to be Jewish. And they happen to be Jewish. J Street is full of people like that, full of people like that. And I think it is a serious problem in the United States for our leaders not to take action regarding, let's say, we talk about lawfare, you know what that is, where the other side has been using the American judicial system, they've been using the Western European judicial systems to attack Israel. Why is it that Tzipi Livni, Ehud Barak, and others can't fly to London? They won't go to London because they're afraid they're going to be arrest warrants.
Is Beinart describing something accurately? Has liberalism in some way betrayed a Zionist feeling? And what Ron said, to me, was very interesting. To what extent has the term Zionism now been in some way redefined so that liberal Jews can't embrace it? And that basically is what you were saying.
I think those who take that position are not, never have been, Zionists.
What do you think?
I don't see the guiding hand. I mean, that's not to say that I'm completely naive and to say that there aren't people who are interested in moving things in certain directions. But I don't see this terrible guiding hand that's delegitimized Zionism. But fact is that for liberal American Jews, especially young liberal American Jews, they look for the connection, and Zionism has become so colored by a certain strain, a certain variety, a certain interpretation of Zionism that they say, phew, like bad food when you're 4 years old.
Is it fair?
I don't think it's a relevant question, Mark, if I can be so bold. I think you have to deal with the cards you played. We can kick and scream all we want that it's not fair, but if you're losing those people, you're losing those people. You can't tell them it's not fair the way you're interpreting the situation. They'll say, well, I'm sorry, this is what I see.
Yes, but if we're losing them because they have either, as Stephen says, no real information and no connection at all, or because their information is seriously flawed, that isn't Israel's problem. That becomes a problem with how the issue is portrayed, especially by those who want to delegitimize Israel.
But it's also Israel's problem. It's also Israel's problem because if it means a long-term erosion of support for Israel in even a segment of the American Jewish community, it's Israel's problem.
I should have said it's not Israel's fault.
Yes. Right. No, I think you're right in that there is a question of information, and that's part of what we do at MERETZ USA. We educate that rights and wrongs apply on both sides. Those sitting around the table may not completely agree, but we do try to educate, and we're certainly not anti-Zionist or anti-Israel, though we have a very different interpretation of what it means to be pro-Israel. But we educate about the history from our perspective. But I don't think it ends at that. I think that there are greater powers. And at the end of the day, I mean, and this is not my idea, but the Israeli Hasbara, the Israeli PR machine as implemented here in the United States, is never going to be able to explain away an occupation. With all the myopia and I agree that there's sometimes lack of historical context. But with all that, at the end of the day, there's an occupation, and young people, especially young people, say there's an occupation, Israel's wrong. The occupier has to be wrong.
It's sort of simplistic, isn't it?
We're dealing with a society. First of all, I don't want to say that it's simplistic because
it
there
is
is
right.
because there is a certain. I think it's very important, that sort of moral imperative, that it does exist. I don't like the idea that we can always explain away everything by context. So I never want to forget that occupation isn't a construct and it's not an anti-Israel effort. It's people living under occupation. Is it simplistic? Yes, I think there's a huge amount of people who don't have enough information, but I don't think it's only simplistic.
My problem with some of the American Jewish left is they often ignore the fact that, yes, in elections you have winners and losers, and sometimes some of the people you don't like are going to win. Secondly, as far as the occupation goes, there's, again, a certain historical myopia here. Until 1993, if you will, the right wing in Israel was saying there is a one-state solution, namely that we will not retreat from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Jordan is Palestine, and we're here from the Jordan to the Mediterranean. Since '93, there's been a bipartisan consensus that a two-state solution is essential for Israel's future as a Jewish state. Well, that is a very liberal position. Somehow or other, the left doesn't give that much credit. The transformation that took place first in Arik Sharon, then Ehud Olmert, and now Bibi Netanyahu, all figures associated with the center-leaning right, is remarkable. Yet the unfairness here is to assume Israel's right-wing state because it's occupying. Yes, it's occupying for historical reasons, but Israeli public figures, both on the right and on the left, are convinced that a two-state solution is absolutely necessary, and the American Jewish establishment wants to assist them in reaching it. The problem is there's no partner willing to do it with.
Can I need to just touch on, I think it's inaccurate to point to an Israeli government from wall to wall, including Likud and Labor, that as in 1993 agreed to two states. I would beg to differ and say Arik Sharon, when he tried to push a little bit in the direction, he never even got there, in the direction of two states by starting with disengagement, we don't know where he would have ended up, was essentially kicked out by his own party. He formed another party because there was a majority in the Likud against him. He took Ehud Olmert and Tzipi Livni with him because they were the minority within the Likud party, which is now the ruling party. There is a huge faction that is putting up a struggle against what Netanyahu's Bar Ilan speech was last year. We don't see any implementation of the Bar Ilan speech. It would be very interesting to see whether Netanyahu could carry the majority of his own party if he proceeded seriously in the direction of a two-state solution along the lines that we know it would be if we reach that point.
Is the majority at the moment for the two-state solution?
I think that there's still a majority. I think that that majority is slipping, and it's slipping on both the left and the right. And I do not believe, though, that the fact that there is a majority is reflected in the numbers in Israel's legislature, the Knesset.
When you look at J Street, and J Street, again, took certain steps forward in 2010, and then, of course, there was the revelation that George Soros, in fact, did provide enormous funding for the J Street organization. And this was after Jeremy Ben-Ami had said repeatedly that Soros was not a funder. But at the moment, what's your view of J Street?
The view is really the same it was before this financial disclosures. Namely, that's an area they have to be accountable to their own donors on, and they have a lot to answer for. But putting that aside, my view is still the same, namely that what has made the special relationship between America and Israel, between Washington and Jerusalem, so special, so different from that between other countries in Israel, has been the support of a strong, vibrant American Jewish community behind that special relationship.
Does J Street deserve a seat at the table?
I'm not in favor of excluding people based on their ideologies. In other words, I prefer to have as broad a table as possible. I think the bottom line remains, though, is that is it advisable for political leadership within the Jewish community to be lobbying in Washington against the stated policies of the Israeli government? In fairness to J Street, they were not the first to break with that consensus. And frankly, during the Oslo years, we heard things like that coming from the ZOA, on the right. In general, I think that kind of fraying of the pro-Israel consensus in Washington before circles of power is highly inadvisable and damaging to the special relationship.
What's the worst mistake J Street makes?
I think the difference between J Street right now and the Jewish establishment is that the Jewish establishment, broadly defined, believes that peace can come about only when the two parties are prepared to sit down, work things out, and are committed to it. J Street's of the belief that only America can deliver the two parties. In practice, that plays itself out in terms of Palestinian politics of we'll sit back and let America do our work for us. And that's why this Obama initiative failed fundamentally. You can't make peace without the willingness of both parties to sit down and do their work.
I agree with what Steve says. I take it a step further. I think, and this has became very, very clear in recent weeks when the initial Obama effort fell on its face. J Street, in addition to what Steve has said, J Street has been exposed, as a lot of people said from the beginning, as simply running interference for the Obama administration, period. They are not the American Jewish lobby to the United States on behalf of Israel. They are the Obama administration's lobby to Israel. That's what it's boiled down to. And they, as Steve said, they are, if you read their emails, they are constantly pushing to get the Jewish public to put pressure on Congress and the administration to in turn pressure Israel. And I think that's unacceptable. I was the head of AIPAC during the Oslo years, and there were organizations that were trying to undermine what the duly elected representative government of Israel was trying to do. And that was a problem. And I told people then, I said, you know what, at some point, I don't know when, the shoe's going to be on the other foot. Mm-hmm. It's very basic. You can just go so far with the argument that we have our constitutional right to lobby our members of Congress. Of course you do. But the idea of lobbying the elected government of Israel really doesn't sit well with most Americans.
Would you give them J Street a seat at the table?
What table are you talking about?
The general table of Jewish consensus and Jewish organizational life.
Well, they're there. They've given themselves a seat. I don't know how seriously they're being taken.
I'll give you a specific example. Okay. There was a synagogue in Newton, Massachusetts.
I remember this, yeah.
And Jeremy Ben-Ami was scheduled to speak, and because of some of the things that J Street has said and stood for, they withdrew their invitation for him to come to speak. This is not the first time. There are other synagogues and Jewish organizations which say basically J Street has taken a position which now puts it beyond the circle of mainstream Jewish life and support for the state of Israel, and that J Street then therefore would, in the simile we're using here, they would not have a seat at the table.
Yeah, two aspects to that. I think it was a tactical mistake for this synagogue to refuse Ben-Ami because that gave him what he really wanted, which was more coverage. I saw the debate between Dershowitz and Ben-Ami, and I thought that was very instructive. From my perspective, if you look at that, I think Dershowitz exposed an awful lot of the J Street agenda, and I think that's fine.
The debate that airs on Shalom TV.
On Shalom TV, exactly. It was moderated by some guy, I think. Right.
Yes.
No, but I think, to exclude somebody, I don't.
Okay.
That's
Do
not
you have
my-
a feeling one way or the other about J Street and a seat at the table?
Yes, I have no problem with J Street having a table at the Jewish communal leadership. I think they, in spite of the fact that my politics are against their politics, I think that they have contributed a lot. I think that many things they do are problematic. Stephen was talking about it. Neal, if anything, elaborated more. But having said that, I still think that they should be at the table. My only disagreement with them is this. I have no problem saying that their group, despite many problems and inconsistencies, is pro-Israel. The problem that I have is I don't agree that they're pro-peace. And I don't agree with what the gentlemen around this table were saying before, that there is some kind of broad consensus in Israel at this point for a two-state solution. I think Ron is right. I think it's slipping. I think the last election that brought Bibi and the conservatives to power was a manifestation of that. Having said all that, J Street, I think, is welcome. I think they contribute a lot of important things. I'm glad that they're at the table.
I don't know how powerful J Street has become. They've made a lot of noise.
They have a lot of entree to the White House.
They have, but because they're doing the White House's bidding, of course.
But that's a powerful position to be in.
Yeah, well.
I'm not, no criticism of anyone.
By the way,
didn't do too much good because the Obama absurd plan that he initiated as soon as coming to office has fallen apart, as all experts realize that.
There was a major shift in Congress when the Soros information came out.
Yeah.
Because congressmen had been promised Soros was not involved. And a lot of J Street's credibility on the Hill was squandered the moment that came public.
J Street's power on the Hill has nothing to do with the conferences they hold or the articles they get out. J Street's power on the Hill will come the way AIPAC's power has been accumulated over the years, and that is that their lay leaders are prepared to shell out money to congressmen to accept their positions. That's AIPAC's power, always has been.
My own feeling about J Street is that if not for J Street, the Jewish community would lose thousands, I don't want to say how many thousands, thousands and thousands of people who care about Israel and who care about a two-state solution. Because the next stop for those who are told that J Street can't be a part, and I'm glad to hear that most people said that it can be, but there are many others in the Jewish community that don't want it. The next stop for those Jews is I'm either out altogether or I'll hitch my wagon to a group like Jewish Voice for Peace, which has Zionists in it, but who say I'm past that. I don't want to be part of a Zionist organization. So J Street is actually, I think, a bulwark for the Jewish community to keep its Jews within it, to keep a broader group.
You know, in March of 2010, Vice President Biden was visiting Israel, and an announcement was made that there would be new construction in East Jerusalem, Jewish housing, and it was seen as an insult to the American government and the American initiative to bring the peace process together, and it required, from Obama's perspective, a settlement freeze. And then, lo and behold, later the same month, Prime Minister Netanyahu comes to the White House, and he is, by all accounts, snubbed. He's left in the Roosevelt room while the president goes to have dinner with his wife. And there's some saying that he ultimately had to leave the back door of the White House, not because he was spirited out that way, but because the idea was he was not supposed to be seen by photographers. To what extent was that a significant event for the Jewish people in 2010, Stephen?
I don't think it had long-range significance. Certainly it was a very uncomfortable moment, and there were all sorts of comments being made at the time of this is the end of the special relationship. Bottom line is, I think both within the administration and the American public at large, there was a broader sense that the particular housing units being constructed were within East Jerusalem, would stay under Israeli sovereignty no matter what. The timing of it certainly was regarded as an embarrassment to Obama and to Biden, and in that respect, and to Netanyahu, frankly, as well. But that's a somewhat different matter. And there was a certain level of, you snub us, we'll snub you. In the broader sphere of things, the basis of relationships between America and Israel is about the popularity of Israel within American public opinion, the recognition of Israel as being a democratic society, the only democracy in the Middle East. I would like to believe, as naive as that may sound, that those bases of support remain powerful enough and they withstand blips on the screen such as that. To that, I would add, by the way, just in terms of understanding Secretary Clinton, when Netanyahu announced the 10-month moratorium, he made it very clear it did not apply to East Jerusalem. She responded by saying, this is a major step forward. So in effect, what was done was fully in accord with those parameters. The timing of it was quite unfortunate, and it resulted in the kind of spillover effect that you're alluding to.
There are many people who feel that this was a manufactured issue, that the Palestinians had never made settlements a precondition for talks, and that even once Israel agreed to a moratorium, the moratorium was on no new construction on the West Bank, that Israel did have a right to build up, not out. And it represented in some way a sweep of a relationship between the American Jewish community and the Obama administration. How would you summarize the arc that we've seen in 2010 in terms of the relationship between American Jewry and the American administration?
You know, the incident you talked about, the White House, and you combined it with the announcement when Biden was in Jerusalem a little before that. I think Steve is right, you know, it's sort of a blip, but I do think it has symbolic significance. Here you had in Israel, as I understand it, the announcement was made at a rather low level, sort of a ministerial level. And it was foolish tactically and diplomatically to have made the announcement when the vice president was there.
It probably was just a mistake.
I think so.
I don't think it was intentional.
No, I don't think at all. And that's my point. It was not intentional.
It was bureaucratic.
I had heard that the prime minister was taken aback and surprised. He was put in an awkward spot. However, having said that, what Obama did to Netanyahu was 100% deliberate. It was intentional, and he was out to send a message. And frankly, in the greater scheme of things, that message galvanized the Jewish community because, make no mistake about it, there was, I wouldn't call it an uprising, but there was great concern expressed by many people, not J Street, but everyone else, and in large measure resulted ultimately in Obama backing down. But I do think when you juxtapose the mistake that was made in Jerusalem to what Obama did, I mean, I frankly think Obama acted like a petulant child. And in the long run, he got his comeuppance.
Yes, what I am saying is that 2010, Buddy, in some way, was a year of conflict between the American Jewish community and the White House, as I have not remembered in years and years and years. And if somebody were to write the Jewish history of 2010 as a theme that should be dealt with, any comment?
I'm on the same page with you on this, Mark, and in fact, I'm engaged in writing it because I'm working on a book about the political developments, but these are related to my support for Sarah Palin. Having said that, it was a very, first of all, you left a couple of things out of the ugly scenario. The 45-minute hectoring phone call from Secretary of State Clinton to Mr. Netanyahu in the aftermath of the gaffe with Biden, after which Bibi had apologized profusely to Biden and to others who would listen and said this was not intentional, this was an error, we have no intention to embarrass you, and in fact, I didn't know that such an announcement even would be made, as you put it, by a lower level committee. So that was one thing. The second thing that was left out was on April 14th, the president standing up and quoted in the lead story on the front page of the New York Times stating that Israeli, or implying that Israeli intransigence on the peace process was putting American troops on the ground in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in harm's way, that Israel's policy were responsible for endangering the lives of American soldiers. This was a very strong statement, even by implication, to come from the American president, from the commander-in-chief. It sent a very clear message, not only to the pro-Israel community here and others, and the anti-Israel community, it also sent a message to, certainly to the Israeli government. In the aftermath of all of that, we had the charm offensive. It's not that the incident blew over. It's that the administration and its advisors realized that unless the whole relationship was basically put on reset, Obama was in deep trouble with American Jews. Charles Schumer had gone out publicly and said he was getting off the bus. Ed Koch, who was always a bellwether of Jewish American opinion on Israel, said, I'm not off the bus yet, but I'm close to it. Ben Cardin, freshman senator from Maryland, very much to the left and supportive of the whole Obama agenda, but he's representing Maryland, said, if there's more rhetoric like this from the administration, you know, their goose is cooked, or ours. And so, at that point, in May, the whole charm offensive was rolled out of meetings with Jewish leaders, of inviting Elie Wiesel, who had published that ad, to the White House, of stroking Ron Lauder, of bringing Ed Koch in, of all of that process. And it went on for weeks, and conference calls and meetings. It went on in weeks and weeks and weeks to try and calm down the American Jewish leadership. But the change in tone did not reflect any change in policy. The policy behind the Obama administration, that they were going to go to the mat with the Israeli government over the issue of settlement construction, did not change until last week. So from March until the beginning of December of this year, that's the arc that you were talking about. That whole scenario played out. Is it dead? I don't know, but I certainly hope that the ugly pressure coming from Washington will recede.
Any comment you want to add?
I agree with, I think it was Stephen who pointed out that part of the problem was that unfortunately the Israeli settlement deceleration, it was never a freeze, didn't include East Jerusalem, and that was stated, and to be fair, the Israeli government stated that.
When you say it wasn't a freeze, are you suggesting
Because there was construction going on.
There was formal Israeli government construction on the West Bank?
There was construction going on.
Are you saying
I don't sit in Israeli government offices.
but
If you consult
yes.
Peace Now's very credible reports, you'll see that there was plenty of construction going on during the freeze.
Yes, but they always took it down.
No.
It was never sanctioned by the government.
I visited in the West Bank. It was interesting. I was in Jerusalem on the day that the construction was announced, when Vice President Biden happened to be there. There's construction going on. Believe me, anybody who tours the West Bank sees the construction going on during the freeze, after the freeze, before the freeze. So I think that part of the problem was that they accepted an Israeli decision that left East Jerusalem as an isolated island, as if it didn't exist as an issue that had to be dealt with. On the one hand, you can't have a situation where the U.S. says East Jerusalem needs to be on the table. Even Israel has gotten to the point where there's a suggestion that East Jerusalem is subject to negotiations. And on the other hand, it is outside the framework of the freeze. And I think that was a mistake, and I think that what happened with the vice president was a result of that mistake. I think that the issue of Netanyahu and the Roosevelt, I think that was all a blip. But I do think that the more important issue, and I think I agree with Buddy, I think that there are ripples from that we're still feeling, and I think one of them that we're still feeling is Thomas Friedman's recent op-ed, which basically said, the U.S. needs to say, good riddance. Deal with your own problems, stew in your own juice, as they like to say in Israel, and then come to us and tell us how terrible the pressure was. So I think that if Friedman, and I hope Friedman's advice to the president and the administration is not adopted, but if it is, I think we'll turn around and look longingly at the day where this terrible pressure was going on, but at least they wanted to be engaged in the process and wanted to bring Israel and Palestine to a situation of peace.
The greatest breakthroughs in terms of Middle East peace negotiations have not come with American pressure. It came from the parties themselves, back with Egypt in '77 and with the Palestinian Authority in '93, and then with Jordan in '94.
I disagree. Well, sorry, I didn't mean to break in.
No, but let me finish for a second.
Yeah.
Both of those initiatives, in many ways, took the administration by surprise. The parties wanted to do it, and they pulled it off. The assumption that America can deliver, I would say, is a very flawed assumption here, because it assumes that America can grab both parties, force them to make peace, and then disengage.
This is what Aaron Miller is saying.
Exactly, yeah. Now, we did have a Secretary of State not that far back, a Republican Party, in the name of Jim Baker, who said, when you guys are ready for peace, here's our phone number. And that was widely regarded as American disengagement and a terrible catastrophe, and Baker certainly was not a great friend of Israel. But the bottom line is that having done so, within 3 years, you had a real peace process, a failed peace process. America could come in only when the process has gone up to a certain point, and as Buddy just mentioned, this is the fundamental theme of Aaron Miller's important book, Much Too Promised Land.
And I would just like you to just elaborate for one moment. What's the tragedy for Israel if America follows the Friedman advice to disengage?
Well, if pursued to its logical conclusion, what Friedman is suggesting is that America has a set of interests, that peace in Israel no longer is really part, unless the Israeli government, I mean, it's not in theory that peace in Israel isn't relevant, but that within the current context of the Israeli government, that the peace process is no longer an American interest. I think
No, he said it was definitely of interest. What he says was, we should take our money, spend it domestically, and let them work it out for themselves. And when they find out that they can't, maybe they'll come back to us.
It wasn't only about the money. It was, we should take our interest and our efforts and take it away.
What efforts?
Diplomatic efforts.
Yes, but how does that hurt Israel in your mind?
Can you imagine in Israel today, without George Mitchell, and I'm not saying that this is a remarkable effort, and I agree with some of the things Stephen is saying. I don't think that the U.S. is omnipotent by any means. But can you imagine in Israel today, without the U.S. providing a certain glow, a certain radiance, that there's a peace process and an effort to reach peace? And
Yes,
I
can, and I don't, and I'm asking this seriously. I don't understand what the danger for Israel is. And I've heard people like Ruth Gavison at Ben Gurion University say, Israelis want peace. They don't have to have peace. Mm-hmm. If we have to live without peace, we will. We want it, but we don't have to have it, and we're not about to make sacrifices for it that will endanger our existence. My sense is that the Israeli feels we like peace. There's nobody to make peace with, and if we have to at the moment maintain the status quo, it's not what we want, but we will do it if we have to. I don't understand what the stick is if the U.S. were now to follow Friedman's advice and say, you know what, fellas, work it out on your own. That's what he's basically saying. Fellas, work it out on your own. What's the downside for Israel?
I think the logical flaw of referring to the status quo is the idea that a status quo is a static development.
The status quo has only gotten better and better, Ron. The West Bank continues to improve. The economy is just flourishing. There have been some reports that maybe incitement is down. Maybe that continues.
I think that for those who want to see some sort of one-state situation between Israel and Palestine, I think the status quo is a golden path to reach that. I think since most of the people around the table, or perhaps hopefully all of us, don't, and there's also other opinions, I think the status quo is a very, very risky place for those who believe in a Jewish state of Israel.
You know, in terms of Friedman's argument, the relationship between the United States and Israel goes well beyond efforts for a peace process. There is military, there's economic, there's intelligence gathering, the war on terror. The relationship is extraordinarily wide and extraordinarily deep, and nothing's going to change that. It's so beneficial to this country to have a close relationship with Israel on so many fronts. The idea that they're going to sort of cut Israel loose and let it go floating to the sea is nonsense.
And that's not what Friedman was suggesting.
Assuming there is slippage in support for a two-state solution, what is the reason for it?
Well, let me
I think a major
very
reason is the fact that you alluded to earlier, Mark, and that is that it's become increasingly clear to a lot of people that Israel doesn't have a real partner at the table.
It seems as if there was a moment of euphoria when many people thought there was a peace process that had possibilities for reaching some kind of positive resolution. And then, as we're meeting, we meet in the shadow of Israel basically saying no to the United States for a $3 billion package, which would have also brought them some very high, sophisticated airplanes, in return for Israel extending the moratorium on new construction on the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, for a 3-month period. So for 90 days, Israel was asked to halt construction. In return, they were going to get $3 billion worth of aid. Ultimately, that deal fell through, and at the moment, no one's talking about any resumption of negotiations. The question I have for the four of you, as we end 2010, do you feel that the peace process has been stymied? Do you believe as we enter 2011 there will be a vibrant peace process?
I can't say that it's dead, because I think the death of the peace process, the true death, if it's not to be revived, we might be looking at the end of Israel as we would like it to see it.
So you don't want it to be revived.
So-
you don't want it to be dead.
But also, I think as someone whose academic field is history, I think that we'll know that in years to come. We don't know that now, but I am very concerned. And I am concerned by not only the breakdown of the negotiations in the diplomatic arena, but I'm concerned by a development that I call post-partitionalism. And it's made up of people not who wish Israel were gone, but of people who want Israel to be there, but have basically given up on the idea that it's going to happen as a sovereign nation alongside a Palestinian nation with a democratic government and a Jewish majority. And you have more and more people, and I think it's going to happen in the United States if it's not happening already, who are planning for the day after the death. And I think that thinking is already going, those interactions are going, and the scenarios are being built of what an Israelstein, as it's sometimes referred to, would look like.
What gives you any hope at the moment?
What gives me hope is that I think that the national desires of the two peoples, the Jewish people of Israel and the Arabs of Palestine, I think that those national forces and national identities are still very strong. So despite the extremists on both sides, I think that there still is a majority on both sides who has not given up, who does want its own nation state giving itself national expression.
Do you have hope still?
Well, I have hope for a somewhat similar reason, but different, namely that the commitment on the part of leadership on both sides to a two-state solution is still there. Now, whether they can deliver remains very much an open question, but that's grounds for hope. Secondly, I guess
They won't sit together.
But again, the ideological commitment that only a two-state solution can work out is found on both sides. Can they pull it off? I'm very skeptical.
There are many Jews who think that the Palestinians, as represented by Mahmoud Abbas, is really not committed to two-state solution.
Look,
and by the way, there are liberal Jews who also think Netanyahu is dissembling.
Yeah. Look, you've got two statements in the last few weeks that sort of underscore that position. One was a statement coming on the Palestinian Authority website that there is no Jewish claim to the Temple Mount, the Western Wall. To issue a statement like that gratuitously at this moment, frankly, is devastating. The similar statement being made about the forest fire, that there was an attempt to, a Jewish conspiracy to allow the Palestinian prisoners to be burned. Again, utter nonsense, a total canard, yet it was made. So I certainly understand the skepticism. What you're asking me is, does one surrender the dream of peace, as even if the hopes for it are so slight? As a Jew, number one, I wouldn't do that, because I think the alternative scenarios are much worse. Secondly, I do think one needs to underscore exactly, so who are the players at present? Netanyahu has undergone evolution. Maybe others would like to see him evolve much more, but the Bar Ilan speech was a statement in principle for a Palestinian state. On the other side, the Palestinian prime minister appears to be a very pragmatic individual. He was on television just this week, in which he said again, only a two-state solution can satisfy both sides.
Yes, but you know, Stephen, there was a question as to whether when he says two states, one of those states is a Jewish state.
Well, this is the reason I think the Prime Minister Netanyahu was correct in saying that there needs to be a commitment to a recognition of Israel as a Jewish state. He was one of the reasons he didn't officially reject the moratorium, but one of the reasons he didn't sign on the bottom line was he said you can't just discuss borders, you have to discuss issues of Israeli security and what that will mean. So in that sense, there's natural skepticism and caution. The road to peace will never be an easy one, and anyone who anticipated that, I think, was quite naive. Conversely, those who have simply signed on the bottom line and said peace is impossible, they're ultimately looking towards a solution where Israel will not be a majority Jewish state, and it'll come about a lot sooner than people imagine.
What's your sense now about the hope for peace, of the peace process being revived in the near future, the beginning of 2011?
Well, certainly the statements of Secretary Clinton indicate that the United States wants to stay strongly engaged, that the pressure will continue to come from Washington, primarily through former Senator Mitchell, and that the United States, even though it has given up on the issue of settlements in Jerusalem and compelling the Israeli government to extend any building, the United States wants to stay engaged. But I have a different perspective from what's being discussed here, which is very simple. There could be a two-state solution tomorrow, I think quite literally tomorrow, if the Palestinians were prepared, if the Palestinians wanted it. It's the asymmetry of the situation is just breathtaking. If Israel laid down its arms tomorrow, there would be no more Israel. If the Palestinians laid down their arms tomorrow, there would be two states. And so as long as we have that asymmetry, I don't see any hope, although we have to hope for peace, of course.
Closing comment.
I think it was about a year ago, or maybe even longer than that, that I sat here and I said, I believe that we're going to see a long, long stretch of the status quo. I believe that then, I think it was true, and I believe it now. I think it's going to carry on. I'm not sure how bad that is. Frankly, I think these WikiLeaks are very, very interesting because I don't think that the Arab world is really all that concerned with the fate of the Palestinians. Frankly, if they were, they could have done something about it ages ago. So I think that it's going to be more of the same.
Gentlemen, we're going to pause, and then we're going to talk about issues having to do with American Jewry. So I hope all of you stay with us and are joining us again next week when the same four gentlemen will be with me to talk more about the end of 2010 and the beginning of 2011. Of course, as always, we'd love to hear your thoughts or comments to the ideas expressed on this roundtable. Please email me or write me this week. And remember, you can also share your thoughts on Shalom TV's Facebook page as well. I look forward to hearing from many of you. And I hope you'll join us next week when we continue our discussion of the Jewish events of importance in 2010. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who can send a tax-deductible contribution of $36 or more to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media to help support our programming. Tax-deductible checks may be made out to GEM and mailed to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. Please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD, and we thank you for your kind support.